Welcome to A Leader's Journey. I'm your host, Joel Gunn. Today I have with me Jason. Jason's a new friend. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
It's good to have you. For those that don't know you, you've got a long track record of business, being an owner and a CEO of a couple of companies at least, and now doing some cool things in coaching other business owners. And you can talk more about that if you want. But just to kind of kick things off, tell us a little bit about yourself. Before we went on the air, you were telling me about the greatest business opportunity ever that you did back in the 90s. Where you did it all correctly the first time.
Oh, yes.
Or did I get that messed up?
No, I think you pegged it. We were chatting about my entrepreneurial journey and if I'd ever done anything in the CEO kind of ownership realm prior to this last decade or so. And I did, in 1999, I was 24 years old and had the great wisdom to start a computer store in the mall, of all places, a retail computer store in the mall in Huntsville, Texas. So I picked a town that their population was mainly incarcerated or in college. So not exactly the best demographic to sell expensive electronics to. And I picked the mall, which was not exactly where people go when they're wanting to have their computer repaired. And of course, I did it in the middle of Y2K, and I had about $3,000 I had saved up, and so that was all the capital that I had to pull this off. So I absolutely did everything right to run a business for about 1 year, and then spend the next 5 or 6 years paying off the debt that I had acquired in doing so. It was awesome. What I didn't tell you was I started that company, that $3,000 that I'd saved up, that's a little bit of a white lie. I had applied to go to college there at Sam Houston State University. And the counselor talked me into doing this financial aid package. And I filled out this FAFSA form. And at the end of it, they sent me a check for $3,100. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? Well, you buy tuition and books and housing and all of these things. And I couldn't think of what are they going to do to me if I don't, right? It's just a low interest loan. So I never showed up to college and I went and started that computer store. So that was the other mistake I made. So it was my MBA.
Nice. So did you always aspire to be a CEO or what was kind of your origin story?
Yeah, I don't know that I wanted to be a CEO as much as I wanted to be a business owner as a younger person. I didn't know that I really thought I thought of CEO as like something that you did when you ran a public company. I always thought it was a little pretentious when somebody had that on their business card and it wasn't a household name organization. But I definitely wanted to be an entrepreneur. After I decided that, being an astronaut wasn't going to be in my path, the two things I wanted to do growing up, well, like a lot of people, I wanted to be an astronaut. That wasn't uncommon for people in my age group. And I wanted to be a computer programmer, a hacker. I was enamored by that part of the world. But beyond that, entrepreneurship was really, I think, a driver for me, probably because I wanted freedom so much. And we can talk about that more in my story. But I was enamored by computers and technology and the future. And I think entrepreneurship was that pin to freedom. And I don't think it's something that I enjoyed a lot of until I reached adulthood.
When did this idea of maybe making tech a career start to gel for you? Or maybe when was the seed first planted?
Yeah. As a career, I don't know that it was where the seed planted. It was an escape. I was probably about 9 or 10 when we got our Commodore 64 computer.
Nice.
For those that remember, a computer you could buy at Toys R Us, and it plugged into the television, and it had a drive, and nobody knew how to use it. And after about a week, my parents got so frustrated that it went from the thing I wasn't allowed to touch to who cares about this stupid thing that doesn't work. And I just pulled out the manual and started playing with it. And it was the first thing that I could manipulate and watch the outcome, and it was just mesmerizing to me. And my grandparents bought me a magazine subscription of the Commodore magazine. And every month it would come with like programs in it. And if you bought the upgrade, you got the disc that had all the programs.
Nice.
They couldn't afford the upgrade. I was just thankful I got the magazine.
You had to type.
So every day I'd come home from school typing in these programs line by line, didn't understand any of it. And inevitably, like a week later, once I got it all typed together, it wouldn't run. And there'd be an error on line 263 or whatever. And so you'd have to go look it up and then look at the magazine and figure out what letter I got wrong. And over time, over the years, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, I began to start to see these structures. And then so when I had an error, I knew then that loop had something wrong with it. And then I could go figure out what was wrong in the structure and fix it. And over time, I think I went from just rote memorization to starting to see how these programs worked. And then I got interested in reading the books. I think next thing you know, I'm probably a 13 or 14-year-old hacking into computer systems all over, Harris County. And that's where I found kind of my people and my place and the place where I fit. And it was an escape. It was the place where I could leave my reality, which was not necessarily the best household to be living in and the best childhood to be in. And I could disappear for 6, 7, 8 hours into code. So I think your question was, how did I get the career in tech? At none of that point was I thinking about this is how I'm going to make a living.
It was fun.
It was fun, and it was an escape.
Yeah.
It was a place to go. It was something none of I wasn't good at making friends, and I certainly didn't want to hang out in the public areas of my household. And so I wanted to go hide in the room and play on the computer. So when I got older, it just became fortunate when it came time to find a career that I had the skill set.
What was your first career in the tech world?
Oh, wow. It was working for a title company. They brought, I keep hitting this mic. They brought these big reels tapes, these reel-to-reel tape drives that were like 12 inches big from the courthouse. And it had all of the title transactions from the week before. And my job and the team I worked on, I was a very junior developer on this team. Our team wrote the software that would convert these tape drives into a database that would run on one of these 386 computers. And it had like its own room and air conditioning that we would maintain this database on. And so at the time, it just felt like cutting edge, edge of the world. And of course, I think we skipped, part of that. For me, it was just transformative to be in an air-conditioned room, putting buttons on a keyboard to get paid for it. And it was surreal, and it was beautiful. And so I did that, and then later I got into jumbotrons, and then the web, and the world kind of went from there.
And what would you say? What would you say some of your biggest takeaways thus far from a leadership perspective? The podcast is called A Leader's Journey. What have been some of your greatest ahas so far?
Oh man, there's a bunch of them. But greatest, one of the most liberating things that I think allowed me to have kind of the career and the journey that I've had was the realization that none of us know what we're doing. That was incredibly opening and eye-opening for me, and that not everything is as it appears. And so an example I'll give there is I'm working at that title company, and when we had discussed the job, I don't have a degree. I had a GED. I was living in a homeless shelter. So my confidence was not exact. It was 19. The confidence levels weren't through the roof that I was, going to land this job. I'm there because of an introduction. And I remember telling them, I don't meet any of the specs for this. I don't have a degree. I don't have any background. I don't have the necessary things. I will do this job for a fraction of what you have it posted for. And they were happy to pay me that. And I was happy to receive that. But over months go by, and I go from, the introverted guy trying not to talk to anybody in the company, lest they find out that I am, not educated enough and qualified enough, and they all laugh me out of the place. At least that's how my self-confidence at the time looked at it. And I start actually, like, they pull me out to lunch with them. They make me go to lunch with them. They make me start interacting with them. And during a conversation, it comes out, I'm like, well, I don't have a degree in computer science, so I really don't think that I'm going to be able to promote much. In fact, I don't even have a college degree. And as we started going around the table, I realized nobody on the development team had a computer science degree. Not one of them. One of them had like an English degree. One of them had dropped out their junior year. One of them never went. And I'm like, so all of you are working for a fraction of the posted amount? And that's the first time that they laughed at me. They never laughed at me for my skills or for many of my other insecurities. But when they found out that I had devalued myself and that I was working for less than the posted amount because I believed that I was less valuable, that was that eye-opener, that I viewed the world in one lens and the reality was completely different. And we are all out here trying to figure it out. And the thing that I think popped into my brain was doctors practice medicine. I practice software engineering. There's people that are better than me and there's people that are worse than me. And there's a whole slew of different positions out there. But I had to remove this mental picture I had of the world to move forward. And I think that was one of the greatest aha moments. That it made me a little more unencumbered.
Yeah. You said something in there I found fascinating. GED homeless, eventually CEO.
Yes.
And now a leader of leaders. Tell me something, like, you can't not talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's, even when I talk about it, it feels surreal, and I lived it. But it really is profound, even as somebody who's gone through it. And I recognize that there is a ton of people along the way who helped me get from A to B. And I had so little to do with that journey other than walking through doors that had been opened for me. And so I don't believe that I had a lot of skill there other than the skill of stepping forward when it was uncomfortable and the courage to do it. But, so I'll tell the quick story. I was a teenager coming out of a pretty broken home. I was intelligent. I had gotten a perfect score on the state standardized test that year, the TAS test. Now I think they call it differently in Texas. There was 4 of us that year that got a perfect score in Texas, and I was one of them. I had put up a perfect score on the ACT, or I think I'd missed one. It was a near perfect score on the ACT, but I didn't bring my calculator. That was kind of fun. So I thought that college was just going to be wide open for me. But as my senior year rolled on and things changed in my household, things changed in my family life, I found myself out on the street and not able to make that bridge into college. And I fell in with a group of people who accepted me and kept me fed and brought me in as part of their pack. And the barrier to entry was pretty low. You just did drugs with them, and you got to join the group. And in doing that, I developed quite a methamphetamine addiction. And so I find myself at 18 years old with an intravenous methamphetamine addiction, living in Houston, and maybe every week or two I can find a place to sleep that's not on the street, but most of the time it's out in the world. And end up getting an older guy teaching me that you can get paid to unload 18-wheelers. So I would ride in these, commercial vehicles to their destination and then unload them for a percentage, usually half of whatever they got paid to unload them. And I could make a little cash that I could then go and buy more drugs so I could stay awake, so I could unload trucks. And it was this vicious cycle. And I found myself in Oklahoma City doing a lumping load to go unload a load of groceries at 18 years old. And Timothy McVeigh had just blown up the Edward Murrow building, I think it's called, in downtown Oklahoma City. And I just remember walking over there, and I'd been awake for probably a day or two. That's one of the benefits of methamphetamine is you don't sleep that much, or at least I didn't. Sleeping and eating were optional. And I'm walking around blocks, just square blocks, no windows. I don't think people realize that the blast, the shockwave just blew every window out for maybe a quarter mile in each direction. And as I'm walking through there, people are they look alien. they're all staring out like they're looking a mile out into the distance and not seeing each other. And it was just this weird place and surreal. And a woman came up to me out of nowhere. I still don't know her name. And she said, "You don't look like you belong here." And I remember thinking, I don't know exact words I said to her, but I think it was something along the lines of, "Lady, nobody belongs here." Yeah. Right? It was just kind of like, what do you mean me? There's probably 10,000 people around us that are all in a position of just shock and trauma and disbelief. And she says, "Well, no, you physically do not belong here. Where are you from?" I said, "Well, I'm from the Houston area in Texas." She says, "I have a nonprofit, and our job is to help people get where they're supposed to be. Can I get you a bus ticket to Houston?" What? This made no sense to me. But I said yes to this complete stranger. She takes me to this office. I fill out some form. They take me to a bus station, a Greyhound bus station, and I get on a bus to Houston. I didn't realize that buses take only like 2 weeks to get from Oklahoma City to Houston. It was like 3 or 4 days.
Yeah, it's a long ride.
So I'm telling a long story. I'll try to make it short. I get to Houston, and I get off, and I don't know what to do. And so I forget who I called, and they ended up putting me in touch with a judge. And this judge gets on the phone, and they say, the drug rehab program for Texas, the governor has just signed the law ending Takata program, so there's no more funding for drug rehabilitation in Texas. And we've got about 3 seats available, maybe 2 or 3 beds left that we have funding for. Let me see if I can get you in. And they came back and said, "I think you got the last bed in Takata." So I either got the second, third, or the very last bed that was paid for by the state of Texas to go through drug rehabilitation, and I did. Come out the other side, go into a rehab program. Halfway house after I get out of the rehab program to reintegrate me into society. So I'm 19 now. Certainly the youngest person there by quite a long time. Most of them have rotated out of prison, so I'm the only one without a kind of a record. And we go to career day, and it's the version of pick which version of construction you want to go into. And when they come around talking about what skills do you have, and they get to me, and I'm like, "Well, I'm pretty good at hacking into computers, and I can write some code." And of course, it got laughter. Nobody believed that a person with my background could do that. And this is where the story kind of ends. We one of their sponsor companies, one of the companies that sponsored the Halfway House, was a title company that had a lot of software. They asked me to come there and basically called my bluff, come there and take our little computer test just so we can prove that you can't and then convince you to go into construction. And they hired me after they proved that I could. So that's how I got into software. And I couldn't believe the money I was making, even though it was less than I was supposed to. And of course, later I made more, and later I made more, until finally I was making too much money. I just couldn't believe it. And so then I spent a career growing in software, eventually becoming a CEO of a couple of companies that I'm sure we'll get to. But that's where that maturation went from GED. So somewhere along there, I got the GED after I dropped out of high school, to being in tech. And again, those were doors that were open for me along the way. I still don't know that lady's name that did that. And when I say surreal, it feels like Forrest Gump. Yeah. And then, I cruised up the ranks. I got to work on Jumbotrons. I did a lot of the software for ESPN Mobile at the Super Bowl in Detroit. Then 9/11 came around during all that, a little bit before that, actually. During that time, I wrote encryption software for the DoD that allowed them to send messages on archaic systems that they had across DoD properties to meet threat levels for 9/11, and that was really interesting. But I realized the company I worked for took my software and made millions of dollars. Oops. And paid me none, and that's when I decided to start looking at entrepreneurship.
Yeah. What's your let's say fears. What's your biggest fears for the next generation of leadership?
Oh, wow. The biggest fears for the next generation of leadership. It's certainly, it's the people aspect, I think. I'm really worried about how humans are going to fit into the equation of business, because I think it's going to be profoundly different, and I don't think that we're prepared for what's happening there. In fact, my wife and I were talking about this a lot last night. I'm enamored with what AI is doing and how it's going to change the future. But the thing we're not talking about is how it's going to change the culture in the business world. I have a 10-person marketing team, and I can jump in ChatGPT in a few years or months as it continues to grow, or a similar LLM, and 2 or 3 people can do the work of that 10-person team. And if our companies are people-centric, and we care about our people as leaders, we're inspiring people to grow, what does the future look like when the productivity of any human can be 4 or 5 times the productivity that it is now by having co-pilot assistance in technology? It's going to greatly increase human productivity, but it's also going to have a massive impact on how we lead teams, when inherently our teams will become smaller to do the same amount of production. And I'm curious to see how the leader of tomorrow is handling that. I hope it's through increased entrepreneurship and business owner, and those 7 marketing people that no longer work at that company go find specializations that they can go and offer to the world. But our current education system is not producing entrepreneurs. It's producing industrial, revolution era workforce. And that might be a bit obtuse, but I think that that's the biggest thing I think about when I think about the future right now.
So do you think the education system needs an overhaul, or is your concern more about how the leader is going to lead culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the bigger concern is how the leader is going to lead culture. Secondarily, I think hopefully all agree, or most of us agree, that our education system needs a large overhaul. And we probably need to relook at it from the view of the consumer, the student.
Yeah.
But that's
I kind of get the younger generations, like, why do I have to go sit through an hour worth of class 3 days a week for 12 or 16 weeks when I can watch a 7-minute YouTube video and figure it out?
Yeah. And be more efficient.
I kind of get that point, right?
I do.
Like, it's hard to argue with.
I don't know how to solve that problem. That's why I'm leaning in on leadership, because I do think that one of the biggest, if not the biggest, responsibility that we have as leaders is to model the behavior that we want to see in the world. As leaders, our biggest impact is modeling the behavior we want to see in the world. And I say that because people outside of the organizations that we lead watch us. People in our families, our communities, people walking down the street see leaders as different people, and they see our behavior, and they believe if I model that behavior, I can be like them. And while that's unfair, potentially, and potentially not true, it is a reality that people look at leaders and look at the behavior they're modeling. And so when we think about technology disrupting the workforce, our leaders can either model behavior that cares about the bottom line more than anything, or they can model behavior that cares about the consumer and their coworker, and that the bottom line is a output and a symptom of doing the first 2 things really well. And I want to see and help more leaders model that, because we're really at 70% right now, Gallup is saying, disengaged workforce in the United States. It's only going to get worse if we keep putting the technology first and the human second. So that's where I'm leaning in, I think, is more on the leadership side. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it does. You and I both engage with leaders a lot, and we've seen good cultures in companies, and we've seen not so good cultures in companies. Has it been your experience in the circles you're running in now that those cultures, would you say they're better than 70% engaged?
Oh, that's a great question.
Or disengaged, whichever the stat was, put it in context of that.
No, that's great. I think when I mentioned it to a group of CEOs recently, and I said, Gallup said that 70% of people recently are disengaged. I think that was a 2022 number, but I don't think the needle's moved a whole lot in the last 18 months. And I asked them to raise your hand if you believe that that is true. every single hand at the table went up. And I asked them, do you believe this is true in your company? And you saw those hands kind of go halfway down, right? Kind of, and it's like, I don't want to believe that I have disengaged people in my company, but yes, there's probably a significant number that are there. And the
reason I
deal with it.
The reason I ask is it's been my experience that leaders that are intentionally working on their leadership, taking a day a month, to be in your Vistage group or in a C12 group or whatever network that they're part of.
Right.
It's been my experience that those companies tend to have better cultures.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would expect, and I know in some studies I've looked at, very narrowly, that they still have disengagement, but not at those levels that Gallup's seeing across the.
Yeah.
Would that be true of
I think
what
that's
you're
true, and I think that's why they kind of put their hands halfway down.
Yeah, it's like
it's not. It's saying
we're not that bad, but we're not perfect.
I think that's where most. If you were to have me gauge and me judge my average company, I would say that they're probably way better than 70%, but they certainly are not down to a number that we would want them to be at, a single digit or
I was going to say 10%
or something.
It's like lean manufacturing. The goal is zero defects, right? The goal is zero disengagement. We may never get there.
You're probably never going to get there unless you have a 2-person team, right? And you're married, then you're probably never going to get there. But 70%, I begin to think about it from a compassionate lens. Immediately you begin to look at it and go, well, these people are stealing from. Wait, no, they're not. You employed them. They're not taking from you. This was a mutual agreement that you're paying them for their work, and they're coming in and working, and you keep paying them, so you must be okay with their work. So it isn't that. To me, it's a compassion issue. I am having a significant portion of the people that come to my company don't want to be here, and they're on autopilot. That should make me feel bad. Not anger, not how dare they, how dare I? How dare I create a culture where 70% or 50% or 40%, even if you're great, 35% is doing twice as good? Who wants to run an organization where 3-4 out of every 10 people don't want to be there? How dare I? And that's the shift I want to see to leadership. It's not the new generation's fault. It's not these young workforce. It's not the post-pandemic world's fault. We lead.
Yeah.
It might not be our fault.
Right.
But it's our problem to fix.
Yeah, we got to figure it out.
That's it. Yeah, we're the ones that they're looking towards. And we have to model that behavior.
You got to lead several companies. How would you suggest people start to address the disengagement issue?
It's a great question. I mean, the first one is the thing that we all know, but hardly ever do. Go talk to your people. Talk to the people you work with, and talk to them as a coworker, as a human, not as their boss or their leader or their supervisor or their manager. In fact, you should always be their leader and not those other things. But they're a human being, and ask them, show empathy, show curiosity, show sincerity. We want people to be around us that care about us. When we know where somebody comes from, helping them get from where they are to someplace better in the future is easier than if I don't know where you come from. And when you know more about me, I am automatically more connected to you. So the first thing I would say is just go do the simple part of having a conversation. Southwest Airlines at one point had the best culture probably of the world. And they said their CEO would just fly around and knew everybody's name at every gate and knew their kids' names and would walk around asking them what was going on and then just get on an airplane and fly to the next airport. And if Herb could do that of a huge airline company, we can walk around our offices and talk to people. So I think that's number one. I think the number two thing that we have to do is realize our culture is what we tolerate. I can tell you what your culture is at your company, not by what's written on the wall, not by the core values that are hung up in pretty colors, not by the mantras that you have pasted everywhere, but by what your team tolerates and what is tolerated in that office. And as leaders, we model the behavior that we want, and we correct the behavior that we don't. And if you want people to be engaged, give them a psychologically safe place to work that has a great vision that they want to get behind and leaders they believe can help them get there. And you'll end up with a much better place.
You hear, been around for years now, but the buzzword transparency and vulnerability and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
How did you model that as a leader? Like you gave some examples just now, or some ideas, but do you have a specific example where you felt like either a lesson learned and you changed your behavior, or how you lived that out, or you found particularly effective?
No, that's a great question. I don't know if I can find the first instance. I'd have to sit and think about it for a while. But for me, one of the things that was most liberating on my leadership journey that helped me get there was when somebody told me, Jason, one of the skills that you need to learn as a leader is you need to be really good at being wrong. And you're not good at being wrong. And we need you to be. And I didn't understand that for a while. And then it kind of fit into my philosophy of my job as a leader is oftentimes to make high velocity decisions. And because I'm making a lot of high velocity decisions, sometimes they're not high quality. And instead of realizing I made a bad decision and then leaning in to making it work anyway, the best behavior I could model would be to stand up immediately as soon as I know it was the wrong one. Say, hey guys, given the data I had at the time, I believe the decision that I made was good. Now that I have additional data, I realize that that was not the way to go. We need to change course. And when I began to get comfortable with that and could then model that inside my organization, I realized a component of psychological safety. If you want everybody in your organization to be their full selves and to show up there and feel safe, you have to be able to model how to be wrong. People are terrified that if my team finds out I'm wrong, I'm going to get punished, I'm going to get laughed at, I'm not going to be seen as a figure of authority, all of these things. And as the CEO or CXO or leader in your organization, when you can show a safe way to be wrong and to still be focused on your customer or your coworker in your endeavor, I think that's that foundation that you build a great culture on top of.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard several stories that would collaborate that very point. You know, successful company turnarounds where they went in and made it okay to be wrong.
Yeah.
You know, and at first everybody sheepishly, like one person finally raises their hand in the meeting and goes, "This is off," and the new leader says, "Thank you for your honesty," and rewards this. You know, somebody raising the hand saying, "We got a problem."
Yes.
And it changed the whole culture, you know, because the prior leader, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, which isn't rooted in a good philosophy, I think. But it had gone so far off the rails to where nobody wanted to ever admit an error or a mistake. And because they see people fired over making major mistakes, and they see people reprimanded publicly for being behind target, you know, or whatever. Yeah. And so I've heard several leaders, you know, even in some global stages, talk about making it okay to be wrong. And I hadn't even thought about that, though, till you said it, because that was several years ago that I've heard some of those stories. But I think you're right. And that's part of that transparency is the not just it's okay for you as a leader to be wrong, but to own it in a big way, like out in the open.
Well, we want that behavior, I think. I mean, one of Jeff Bezos' things that I don't take a whole lot from Jeff, but one of the things that I really liked was this idea that there's nothing better than a delightfully dissatisfied customer. That is the greatest asset of any business is a disgruntled customer, because they'll tell you exactly what is wrong with your company. They will tell you exactly what it is that they did not like. And if you've built a culture where you're not hearing what's wrong, then you're going to have a problem. And I think of Pixar when I think of that. Like, this is a company that's never released a movie to the theater that didn't release it #1 in the box office. So either they're perfect or they have a culture inside of that company where they can point out every little flaw with the story And they've got a culture where the directors and designers and artists can take that feedback and continue to iterate until they have built the best thing they can. So when I hear you can't do this with creatives, you can't do this with blank, fill in the blank, and then I think of Pixar, I just want to challenge, is that a belief or is that a fact? Right?
And I would suspect they have a good customer feedback loop.
You have to.
Right? To maintain that level of excellence.
You have to. And it has to make it to the top. Right? If you know, the other thing I see CEOs do, and I call it the Stalin papers. Towards the end of Joseph Stalin's life, you know, he was just a terribly brutal despot, really. But towards the end of his life, the people around him were so afraid of what he did when he got bad news that they had a second version of the paper printed every day that they gave to Comrade Stalin, because if he saw the bad news in the real paper, somebody was going to get killed, or, you know, there was going to be some horrible thing that happened. And so to control his anger and his outbursts, they gave him a fake newspaper full of good news, the things he wanted to hear. How many CEOs, when they're getting their reports each week, are their teams protecting the company from the CEO? And if you have that culture, if you're not hearing about your delightfully dissatisfied customers, if your managers are afraid to come tell you, I messed up, and now we have a whole slew of customers that are unhappy with us, that's a bigger problem than the slew of unhappy customers.
Yeah, you know, and isn't that a beautiful way to model this concept of grace, though? Right? Like if a manager comes to you and says, I screwed up, thank you for your honesty. Thank you for coming to me before this thing gets any worse. I'm going to extend whatever word you want to call it, grace in this situation. If you want to fire somebody, fire the guy that keeps covering up the truth, right? Like, I mean, if you just got like, if you got to pick between the two, which one should we be firing? The one that the bearer of the bad news, who's trying to be transparent and, you know, make sure everybody's got all the information they need to make a good decision, or the person that's bearing the story, you know? And so anyway, it just got me thinking out loud there.
We hire and fire for culture. I believe that to my core. Now, sometimes you have to fire the person, you have to release the person that you don't want to, that you've given grace to, that's a lovely human, that you've gone through all of the steps to try to get them there, but you can still do it a compassionate way.
Yeah.
You can still humanize them. But you're right. I think we want to have a culture of grace. I want to have a culture where we can make mistakes. I want to have a culture where we care more about the outcome than we do about who got us where using what. We are a team that is trying to serve a purpose. And yeah, I definitely want to model this idea of grace. I want to model this idea of compassion, that even when you don't fit on the team anymore, it's compassion, not punishment.
How do you exit well, and well, how do you exit people well? You know, like you said, compassionately.
Do it compassionately.
You know, and I heard of a nonprofit organization does really great stuff for the world, really, really good stuff for the world. They had a vice president they escorted out of the building. Well, nobody, I mean, you expect that at a cybersecurity company or a Department of Defense, or if the guy, you know, was, you know, stealing from, you know, shredding papers at Enron or something, fine, exit him out of the building. But that's just a bad cultural, you know, like that freaked the nonprofit, all the field, the people in the field, everybody, and they're a nationwide, if not global, nonprofit. So you've got to be like aware of, like you said earlier, people expect certain things from leaders. So how much damage did that one action do, which you know is not the heart of that organization?
Yeah,
you know,
it's curious. I don't know. That's kind of like me looking at a photograph and trying to tell you what emotions people are feeling. And I'm going to automatically look at that photo and begin to project different parts of my experience onto that photo. So I'm going to answer your question two different ways. If that human being had just embezzled $1 million and they found it out, that I'd say the best thing for your culture is to say, stand up, put your keys on the desk. We're walking out the front door right now.
Yep.
And I want my entire culture in that company to know we just found somebody embezzling large amounts of money, and we walked them right out the front door because we do not tolerate that behavior inside of our organization. And I'm sorry that we've had you working with somebody and we didn't catch this sooner.
Yep.
So on one hand, it might be the absolute best thing that you ever did. Now, I'm going to tell that's probably in 1, 2, or 3% of the time. I'm going to agree that in 97% of the time, there was a better way to handle this. There was a more humane way to handle this. There's a more compassionate way to handle this. And think about if you're the person that's not working there anymore. And if I'm a vice president or whatever they were, I would hope that you would give me the dignity to pack my own things and maybe even do it on a Saturday. I would prefer you to decide how you leave my organization than me to.
Yeah. Would you like to leave today or 2 weeks or? Yeah. Well, and the worst thing I think that one came to mind as we were talking is they never officially announced why that person was let go.
That's terrible.
Right.
I mean,
So it could have been the $1 million embezzling, rare instance, but nobody knows.
And that becomes even the bigger problem. Right. Even if I can't tell the company why you left, and sometimes that's the case, right? We signed a separation agreement or something that had legal.
Or it was medical and it's nobody's business, HIPAA and all that.
Whatever. But even then, have the decency to say, Jason's no longer with the organization. We appreciate the 4 years that Jason spent here. And, if you ever see Jason out on the street, be sure to say hi. They're always going to be a member of our family. Whatever. You don't have to, run over them on the way out the door or whatever. But I don't think that you need to treat
the thing is the reason it was a shock, and I had a very close friend that was part of the organization at the time. The reason it was a shock to the organization is because it was such the antithesis of their culture. They're like, what just happened here, right? And there was no explanation. So if they'd come out and said, hey, we caught the guy embezzling $1 million, we're not going to put up with that. Or we caught the guy violating these core values in an extreme way, and we feel like that wasn't representative of who we are as an organization. And this is why we took this stand that we took.
I would say they have a culture that here we have a culture that we walk leaders out the front door without telling anybody why. I mean, I don't care what's written on the wall.
Right. That's what got me thinking about it was your comment earlier about your core values are what you're living, not what you're writing.
Yeah, they're saying this isn't our culture. Yes, it is. It might not have been in your culture before, but now it is. This is a company or an organization where we walk out senior leaders without telling anybody. And maybe that's the culture you want. I can imagine why you would. I can't think of a company where I would want that culture, but I mean, if that's what you want, then show that behavior. And then if you do it and people start giving you feedback and you go, oh man, I should have realized that. Now that you point it out, I look like a jerk walking that person out the front door. Oh my goodness, how did I not think? Of course, people are like, well, how didn't you think of it? Well, we're humans.
Yeah. Caught up in the moment.
But let's go back to good at being wrong. You have an opportunity the next day or the next week to send an email out to the whole staff.
Or even 2 years later, you finally realize it.
Yeah. Jason wasn't here. I'm sorry the way it happened. Unfortunately, I cannot talk about the things that transpired, but I want to let you all know that this is not the kind of company and organization we have. This was a one-off situation. And while I cannot disclose the details, I would hope that all of you would have agreed with the outcome had you known what happened. Like something like that, it can just say, I recognize I was wrong, and here's what we're going to do. Assure you that you're not going to get walked out the door this way.
You mentioned about that may not have been the culture prior to that day, but as of that day, it's at least a consideration, right? Or concern. My really good friend still has connections in that organization, and it's still talked about years later. Because the record's never been set straight. It's not happened since, but every time structure changes happen, everybody's like, well, is this another one of those days? Somebody's going to be walked out the door. So it's there now, to your point. What do you do in a situation, and this is hypothetical, or maybe you've experienced it, but culture has changed, accidentally or on purpose. What do we owe the people that are on the team as of that day? Like, hey, like as leaders, do we have a responsibility to come out and say, we're shifting who we are? And so if you want to stay here, great. And if you don't, do we owe them that to say, this is who, when we hired you, you thought we were this organization. We portrayed these values, whatever those are. Could be left, could be right, could be center, whatever, right? I'm not defining what those are, but we hired you and you perceived us this way. 3 years later, we've made a decision to go a different way. As leaders, do we owe that to the team to explain this is our new culture?
Yes, and I think that we should be doing it even selfishly. If I'm leading a team and I'm not sincere in what I want the culture to be and the vision and where we're going, then I am manipulating my fellow human into doing something that they believe is true that isn't. So the second time I became a CEO, most recently, the last time I became a CEO, I can't talk a whole lot about this story, but I'll give some very high detail. 6, 7, 8 years ago now, I'm a minority owner in the company. I'm running another company as CEO. And that company was smaller, the one that I was not running, but was a minor investor in. It only had a 4-person leadership team outside of the CEO. And one day, all 4 of them showed up at my office at my other company, which is a little weird. And it's like, hey, guys, what's going on? And if you've ever seen Band of Brothers, there's a scene where like all of the sergeants turn in their resignation because they want to get rid of the CO that keeps running them up and down Currahee or whatever. And of course, they punish them and say, well, you know, you're not allowed to do that. But they also demoted the person. All 4 of them walk into my office with their resignations. And I mean, the company's like a 9 or 10 person company with a 4-person people in leadership that also did a lot of other things. So we're down like 40% of the company, and the highest, ranking 40% of the company. It's like, here's our resignations. And, had to have a conversation. And the outcome of that conversation was the CEO that was there was no longer there. Those 4 leaders stayed. And then they brought me in as the interim CEO. And I ended up sticking around for 6.5 years. It was the longest interim position I've ever taken. But I say all of that to set up. I walked into that culture where the entire leadership team was saying, we're walking out the door. We quit. It's so bad here. I start walking around to the front line. And they're all basically letting me know, don't worry, I update my LinkedIn weeks ago. As soon as I get a job offer, I'm out of here. And I start thinking, holy smokes, I ought to be running a team of none here in 2 weeks. And
that's going to look really good on a resume.
Yeah, how am I going to keep this company going? If I can't do all 9 people's jobs, that's impossible. And so to take it full around, how do you change a culture? I think good at being wrong, sincerity, and have the courage to say, this is where we're going. Don't manipulate them and lie to them because I can't afford for any of you to leave. Right? No, I was walk into a room at the end of the day and say, guess what? I'm your new CEO. Like it or not, the boat pulled into port. The old captain got off, the new captain got on, and we just pulled out of port. So right, wrong, or indifferent, I'm the new captain of the ship. And with that comes the responsibility of trying to keep this crew together. And here's the culture that we will build today moving forward. And hold me accountable. Vote with your feet. If I do not do this, leave. Here's the vision, the place we're going. And here's the place we will be in 12 months. And if this excites you, stay here. And if it doesn't, you come see me in the next week and I will help you find a new job. You don't have to quit behind me. We will sit down and pick up the Rolodex and I will start calling everybody I know until you got a job at a place you want to be. 0 people quit. We won 2nd place in best places to work next year in San Antonio. People just want to be treated like humans, know where they're going, and have that sincerity. And if any of them didn't agree with the culture that I wanted to build and that I wanted their feedback in building, they would have left. And that would have been fine because they didn't fit. I hope that answered your question.
No, it does, and that was kind of it's kind of been the thoughts I've been thinking along those lines, and to your point earlier about being compassionate. The most compassionate thing you could do in that scenario was exactly what you did, and say, "Here's what it is. Here's what it's going to be." And if you want to do, if who you are doesn't align with where we're going, that's okay.
And if you're not, that's okay.
You can exit friends.
Yeah.
Like, I'll help you find another thing that is a better fit for you. And I don't know what your experience has been. I don't think in general, I know a lot of people do it well, but like you did it well in that scenario. I think in general, a lot of leaders don't do that part well.
I didn't. I mean, I didn't when I started. It was learned behavior for me. But when I observed the leaders that I wanted to emulate when they were modeling that behavior, one of the observations I had was sincerity and courage. And I like to use the word sincerity when I talk about myself. I don't feel comfortable necessarily using the word courage to talk about myself. But I think of courage as just action. We already know the right thing to do is to go tell them this thing. And then fear says, well, what if they quit? So I'm not going to tell them because I'm afraid they're going to quit. When I realized that courage just meant action of doing the thing I already knew I was supposed to do, and then you go and do it, and the fear doesn't come true, they're all going to walk out the door. No, they were all going to walk out the door already. And so while I appreciate the compliment or whatever the observation there was, it wasn't innate. I was not born with that. That is something that I learned by watching other leaders model great behavior. And typically it made me shocked. I'm like, what just happened? That's not what I expected to happen. And then you kind of put that in the brain and think, oh, wow, I want to model that. That's the kind of leader I want to be. And so when those opportunities arise and you know what you're supposed to do and you're deciding not to do it, sit down and ask, is this what's being courageous and sincere? And if I were on the other side of this coin, would I want the whole story? And if the answer is yeah, just tell it. Have the courage to be real.
Feels like a good place to land the plane on this episode. Any final thoughts?
This was a lot of fun, Joel. Thank you so much for having me here. I had no idea what I was going to expect walking in. Great questions, great environment. And that's it. Just thank you.
Yeah. Love to have you back. Thank you for your time.
Awesome.
It's an honor to have you here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for joining us for this episode of A Leader's Journey podcast. If you enjoyed it, give us a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to our channel.